Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. O Lord, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto all. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you all for coming. Today at the very time that this lecture is starting, there's a big World Cup match between Spain and Germany. So I appreciate your making this great sacrifice to attend this lecture today. So today's lecture explores what I would call a deceptively simple question. The question is, what is Vedanta? And many of you might think, well, it's very obvious, but I don't think it's obvious. And part of the point of today's lecture is that there's no one right answer to the question. There are many different possible answers. So what I'd like to do today is map out some of the possible answers to this question. So if you imagine a kind of map, I want to give a high-altitude topography or map of different Vedantic traditions, different Vedantic landmarks within the broader territory or continent of Vedanta. There are many different Vedantic countries within this vast continent. So one tendency which I think many followers of our tradition, but of many other Vedantic traditions make, is to identify Vedanta, the word Vedanta, with one particular tradition of Vedanta. And I'm sure you can guess which tradition, Advaita Vedanta. So this is a common mistake that's been made for centuries, especially in India, for many, many years. Vedanta typically means Advaita Vedanta, and I think that's a serious mistake. Because there are many other schools of Vedanta that are equally Vedantic. They count just as much as Vedanta as Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Swami Medhananda himself made this point. So I'm going to read a somewhat long passage where he says this, because I think it's important, and many people aren't aware of this passage in the complete works of Swami Medhananda. So Swami Medhananda says the following: unfortunately, there is the mistaken notion in modern India that the word Vedanta has reference only to the Advaita system. But you must always remember that in modern India, the three prasthanas are considered equally important in the study of all the systems of religion. Prasthana means pillar or foundation, and the three prasthanas are the three scriptural pillars of Vedanta, and he's about to explain what these three pillars are. The Upanishads, 1. The Vyasa Sutras, 2. Vyasa Sutras, another name for Brahma Sutra. And 3, the Bhagavad Gita. Therefore, have been taken up by every sect in India that wants to claim authority for orthodoxy, whether dualist or Vishishtadvaitist or Advaitist. The authorities of each of these are the three prasthanas. We find that a Shankaracharya or a Ramanuja or a Madhvacharya or a Vallabhacharya or a Chaitanya, anyone who wanted to propound a new sect had to take up these three systems and write only a new commentary on them. Therefore, it would be wrong to confine the word Vedanta only to one system, which has arisen out of the Upanishads. All these are covered by the word Vedanta. The Vishishtadvaitist has as much right to be called a Vedantist as the Advaitist. So this is a very important statement made by Swami Medhananda. Many of us think when we read him that he just taught Advaita Vedanta, but that's not true. He taught Vedanta, and he understood Vedanta as encompassing all the different schools of Vedanta. So, to begin, what is Vedanta? We first need to distinguish three different meanings of the term Vedanta. The first and primary meaning of Vedanta is the Upanishads themselves. Because the word Vedanta etymologically means Veda plus Anta. Anta means end, but in a metaphorical sense it can mean culmination. And Veda means the scripture, the Vedas. And the Upanishads are the culminating portion of the Vedic scriptures. Culminating in the sense that they contain the highest spiritual teachings found in the Vedas. This is the first and primary meaning of the term Vedanta. Not any particular philosophical school, but the Upanishads themselves. And of course, the Upanishads have been interpreted in many different ways over the years by different schools. That we're going to get to that soon. But the second main meaning of Vedanta is a bit broader. Instead of just encompassing the Upanishads, it says that this definition is Vedanta includes the Prasthana Traya. Swami Medhananda just mentioned it, Prasthana Traya. The three Prasthanas, the three scriptural pillars of Vedanta. What are they? Upanishads plus Bhagavad Gita plus Brahma Sutra. So this is the secondary meaning of Vedanta. Sometimes when people refer to Vedanta, they mean all three of these scriptures. And there's yet a third way of defining Vedanta. Vedanta can refer to any one of the many philosophical schools of Vedanta. Any one of the philosophical schools which accepts the authority of the Upanishads. And there are many of them. And that's part of the point of this lecture, is to introduce you to some of the major schools of Vedanta and some of the main doctrines of Vedanta. So the first thing is, when somebody talks about Vedanta, you might want to ask them, how are you defining Vedanta? This is the first, okay? So now, in today's lecture, I'm hoping to cover, if I have the time, 4 main questions. The first one is, what are these different schools of Vedanta? What do these different schools of Vedanta have in common? What are the main differences in the main doctrines of these different schools of Vedanta? How are these doctrinal differences in different schools of Vedanta, how are they reflected at the level of spiritual practice? How does it affect us as sadhakas, as spiritual aspirants? And what can we learn from all of these different schools of Vedanta as spiritual aspirants? That's the third question. And the fourth question, where do Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's teachings on Vedanta fit in to the scheme? Can we align them with any of the existing traditional schools of Vedanta, or do their teachings constitute a new school of Vedanta? This is a very controversial question. And again, the tendency is to align Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta with one of the traditional schools, namely Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And I think that's a serious mistake, because what's lost is the harmonizing impulse behind the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. If we pigeonhole the views of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda into one particular traditional school, it means that their view is not Vishishtadvaita and it's not any of the Bhakti schools. But the beauty of their philosophy, as I want to show at the end of my lecture, is that they beautifully harmonize the different schools of Vedanta by being what Swami Vivekananda called a non-sectarian sect. It's definitely a new school of Vedanta, but one that's broader than the existing or traditional schools of Vedanta. So let's begin. So what are the major traditional schools of Vedanta? I'll distinguish 4 of them. First is Advaita Vedanta. I hope most of you are familiar with it already. The first known text, the first available text in this tradition is Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika. And Shankara was Gaudapada's disciple's disciple. And he produced commentaries in Sanskrit on the Prasthanatraya, on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra, trying to show that all these scriptures support his philosophy, which in a nutshell is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Non-dual pure consciousness alone is the reality, and the world of names and forms is ultimately non-existent. Second school of Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, otherwise known as Sri Vaishnavism. This is a school founded by Ramanuja, who is a great bhakti philosopher. Third school, Madhva Vedanta. This is generally known as Dvaita Vedanta, but many followers of Madhva's tradition do not appreciate that label, and so I think it's better to avoid a label that they themselves don't like. And instead we can use a neutral label, Madhva. Madhva just means the school founded by Madhva. And fourth, Bheda Vedanta. Bheda means, so Bheda means difference, Abheda means non-difference. So it's this kind of paradoxical sounding doctrine, difference and non-difference. This is a separate school of Vedanta, the school of difference and non-difference Vedanta. And then there are 4 sub-schools under this general school of Bheda. So I hope your head doesn't get too dizzy. So first sub-school, Aupadika Bheda. This is founded by Bhaskara, who was a contemporary of Shankaracharya, 8th century, roughly. Second sub-school of Bheda Vedanta is called Swabhavika Bheda, which was founded by Nimbarka, who is another great bhakti philosopher. Third sub-school of Bheda Vedanta is called Achintya Bheda Vedanta, or Gaudiya Vaishnavism. This was founded by Chaitanya and then systematized by disciples like Jiva Goswami and Rupa Goswami. And fourth and finally, the fourth sub-school of Bheda Vedanta is called Shuddhadvaita, otherwise known as Pushti Marga. This was founded by another great bhakti philosopher named Vallabha. If you're interested in more details beyond this lecture on the doctrines of these schools, I would strongly recommend a book by Swami Tapasyanandaji, who was a great monk of our order, a vice president of our order. He wrote a book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta because he felt that most followers of our tradition They know Shankara's Advaita Vedanta fairly well, but they know next to nothing about the Bhakti schools of Vedanta. And so he explained the main doctrines of the Bhakti schools. And in a beautiful 20 to 25 page introduction to this book, he also discusses Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta and explains what's unique about it. So one of my main influences is Swami Tapasanandaji. Another important point before moving forward is this. I just laid out some of the traditional schools of Vedanta. I think we should not make the mistake of assuming that Vedanta is a static tradition. It's a tradition that's continually evolving. So just because, centuries ago there were these 5 schools or whatever, 7 schools of Vedanta, it doesn't mean that we can't think new thoughts and innovate in different ways, because I think every great Vedantic thinker and saint who comes along, including Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda and many others, they have to innovate. Otherwise, what's the point in their coming? So to give you one example, there's an organization, a monastic organization called Swami Narayan. This is a bhakti tradition. Many of you might be familiar with it. They have some centers in different parts of US, huge temples in India. There's a beautiful one called Akshardham, I think in Delhi. And their philosophy is close to Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita, if you want to try to link it with some traditional school, but it has its unique differences. So they call their philosophy Akshar Purushottam Vedanta, a new school. But as Swami Vivekananda mentioned in the passage I read before, in order to establish yourself as a new Vedantic school, you have to provide commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. So what one intrepid scholar / monk of the Swami Narayan tradition did is he produced Sanskrit commentaries on all 3 of these scriptures. And that's what enabled them to call themselves a different sect of Vedanta. Even though it's very similar in some ways to Ramanuja, there are also some differences. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Let's not get stuck in the past. We should be open to the possibility of innovation and newness, even in the context of Vedanta. So before I get into the somewhat technical differences between the different schools of Vedanta, I wanted to emphasize, what do all the different schools of Vedanta have in common? And I wanted to point to 5 basic commonalities. First, all of these schools of Vedanta accept the authority of the Prasthanatraya, the 3 scriptural pillars of Vedanta. They all say that our foundational scriptures are the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. Of course, then you might ask, well, but they don't interpret these scriptures in the same way. Exactly. So each of these schools interprets the same scriptures in different ways. And they argue about the best way to interpret the scriptures. But they all accept the authority of these 3 Vedantic scriptures. First commonality. Second commonality. They all claim that we suffer and we remain trapped in the cycle of transmigration, of rebirth, because we are ignorant of the ultimate reality, which they refer to as Brahman, and because we're unaware of our true spiritual nature, that we're actually eternal souls, separate from, so now I get to the third doctrine. We are not the ephemeral body-mind complex. We're not the physical body. We're also not the mind. Every Vedantic school, this is something that is startling to some Westerners who don't know much about Vedanta. Every Vedantic school says that even the mind is insentient. It's a weird idea. It sounds like a weird idea to the Western mind. But the mind is as insentient as a body. It's just a subtle form of matter. The mind is a subtle form of matter. And the only conscious entity is the soul that's illuminating the mind and making it seem as if the mind is actually conscious. So that's the third commonality. We are not the body-mind complex. We're actually the eternal soul, separate from the body and separate even from the mind. Fourth commonality. We can gain knowledge of the highest reality, Brahman, through certain spiritual practices. And again, there are differences with regard to which spiritual practices lead directly to the knowledge of Brahman. We'll get to that later. But the commonality is that we can attain knowledge of Brahman. This is different from some agnostic doctrines. For instance, Kant said we can never have knowledge of God, but we should have faith in God. But Vedantic schools say you can start with faith, but faith should culminate in direct realization of God. That's an important aspect of Vedanta, and that's common across the schools of Vedanta. Fifth commonality. When we attain knowledge of the ultimate reality, Brahman, we attain the highest bliss and the highest goal of life, the summum bonum. There's nothing greater than attaining knowledge of Brahman. They all accept this. And minimally, we can escape from the cycle of rebirth. That's one of the great advantages. That's why they call it moksha, liberation. Now, keep in mind these commonalities as we now enter the the more thorny issues. How do these different schools of Vedanta differ? I want to raise 6 basic questions and explain briefly how some of these different schools of Vedanta answer these questions. First big question. What exactly is Brahman? They all accept that Brahman is the highest reality, but how do they define Brahman? What is the nature of Brahman? Advaita Vedanta, Shankara school, is the only school of Vedanta that holds that Brahman is ultimately completely devoid of attributes. And it's non-dual. It's the only reality. And so Shankara's followers claim that the personal God, Ishvara, the ruler of this universe, that supreme being who listens to our prayers, responds to our prayers, and so on and so forth, it's only real from what he calls the empirical standpoint, from the Vyavaharika standpoint in Sanskrit. But when we attain the knowledge of the highest reality, which is non-dual pure consciousness, Brahman, we find that this entire world of names and forms and the personal God never existed. Okay, where does he say this? He says this, for instance, in his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.14. Thus, Ishvara's rulership, Ishvara here is just a Sanskrit term for the personal God. Thus, Ishvara's rulership, omniscience, and omnipotence are dependent on the limiting adjuncts conjured up by ignorance. Limiting adjuncts is a Gambhiranandaji's translation of upadhis in Sanskrit. But from the ultimate standpoint, such terms as the ruler, the ruled, omniscience, etc. cannot be used with regard to the Atman, shining in its own nature after the removal of all limiting adjuncts through knowledge. So this is a bit technical, so let me try to unpack it a little bit. According to Shankara school, the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness, Brahman. But out of ignorance, we superimpose all sorts of false attributes onto this one non-dual reality. One of those false upadhis is the upadhi, the limiting adjunct of being the personal God. In reality, there's no personal God. There's also no individual souls. There's also no, I'm not actually talking to any of you. This is the ultimate standpoint. Okay, so now, I wanted to address one common objection. Whenever I say this, I sometimes get this objection, especially from some of the followers of Sarvapriyanandaji. They say that, wait a minute, but Shankara was a great bhakta. He wrote so many devotional hymns. So let me just try to respond to this objection. So they say that Shankara was the author of devotional hymns like Bhaja Govindam, Saundarya Lahiri, etc. Okay, let me just say 3 things about this. First of all, the near consensus among scholars who have studied these texts is that Shankara probably did not compose these devotional hymns. That's the first thing. But secondly, even if he did compose these devotional hymns, he could easily have written them from what he calls the Vyavaharika standpoint, the empirical standpoint, the standpoint of spiritual dummies. This is the talk is called Vedanta for Dummies. He might have composed these beautiful devotional hymns for idiots who are not capable of the highest practice of Jnana Yoga, right? That's also a possibility. Third possibility. Again, even if he did compose these devotional hymns, those people who believe that he did are still stuck with a very difficult challenge. The challenge is, everybody accepts that Shankara composed the 3 commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, his commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. And I just read to you a very explicit passage from his commentary on the Brahma Sutra saying that the personal God is ultimately non-existent. And there are many places, especially in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, where he says that Bhakti Yoga is not on an equal footing with the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. So these people who believe that Shankara was a great bhakta and that he composed these hymns are still stuck with the difficulty of reconciling these devotional hymns with what he says about the personal God and bhakti in his commentaries on the scriptures, which nobody doubts are his. So those are my 3 short responses, but I'm happy to, if you want to follow up on that, I'd be happy to talk about it. Okay, so Advaita Vedanta says that Brahman is ultimately only nirguna, devoid of all attributes, non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. What do the other schools say? Every other school of Vedanta says the opposite, which is they are theistic schools of Vedanta. Theism means, this is a Western term, but the idea is that they believe in God as a supreme personal being with what are called omni-attributes. Omni-attributes are things like omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, which means all loving and perfectly loving and moral. But there are some subtle differences even between the different bhakti schools, theistic schools of Vedanta. Ramanuja's school of Vishishtadvaita, Madhva Vedanta, and many schools of Bheda Bheda hold that Brahman is only personal. The Sanskrit term is saguna. Only personal, which means it's the exact reverse of Shankara's philosophy, which is that the Brahman is ultimately only nirguna, without attributes. These schools, Vishishtadvaita, Madhva Vedanta, and some schools of Bheda Veda, say that Brahman is only saguna. But there are two schools at least of Vedanta which have a slightly different view. Shuddhadvaita Vedanta of Vallabha and Achinta Bheda Veda Vedanta of Chaitanya, they both hold that the ultimate reality, Brahman, is both nirguna and saguna. Okay, so they say both. Ultimate reality is both with attributes and without attributes, both impersonal and personal. But there's still a hierarchy, and they say that the supreme reality is Krishna, the personal God Krishna, and nirguna Brahman, that Brahman talked about by Shankara and his followers, that non-dual pure consciousness, is just what's the technical term here is tanubha in Sanskrit. It's just the peripheral brilliance of Krishna himself, a very minor aspect of Krishna. And Vallabha says something similar. He says that Shankara's Brahman is just the foot of Krishna. Okay. So both of these schools turn the tables on Advaita Vedanta, saying that the highest reality is not non-dual pure consciousness, it's actually the personal God. And Nirguna Brahman is just a minor aspect of Krishna. So there's a lot more I can say, but I want to be brief on all these 6 questions. So that's enough for the first question. What is the nature of Brahman? Second big question, is the world real or unreal? Advaita Vedanta, again, is the outlier here. Advaita is the only school of Vedanta which holds that the world does not exist from the ultimate standpoint. And Advaitans maintain that the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness. That's why the standard formula is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. And then it continues, Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha. I'll get to that shortly. Shankara's favorite example to compare the relationship between Brahman and the world, he says it's like the rope and the snake. Brahman is like the rope. When we mistake a rope for a snake, does it make sense to say that snake is... there was a snake there for some time, and then I realized it was a rope, and then the snake disappeared. No, there was never a snake. Exactly in the same way, there's always been Brahman all along. And out of ignorance, we superimpose this entire world of names and forms, the personal God, all these things on a Brahman. But in reality, there's nothing but Brahman. This is Shankara's position. Every other school of Vedanta holds that the world is real, but impermanent, and that all the other schools of Vedanta agree that the world has no independent existence apart from Brahman. The world has no existence apart from God, but it's fully real. Okay, third big question. What is the relationship between Brahman and the world? Brahman and Jagat. That's a Sanskrit word for the world of names and forms. This is a very sensitive question because it raises a massive problem. This is a massive problem in all theistic traditions across the world. It's what's called the problem of evil. How does the perfect, pure, infinite God, Brahman, relate to an imperfect, impure, and impermanent, ever-changing world? If you bind God too closely with the world, the danger is that you're infecting God with the evil qualities that are present in this world. We all know that there's some, this world is not perfect, right? So that's the problem, the philosophical problem. And different schools of Vedanta respond to this problem in very different ways. Advaita Vedanta, as usual, comes up with a very different kind of approach from the other schools. What followers of Shankara say is that you're asking what the relation is between Brahman and the world? In fact, there is no relationship between Brahman and the world. There's only Brahman, no world. This is called the doctrine of Vivartavada. Vivarta means illusory appearance. So this is the doctrine that this world is only an illusory appearance of Brahman. But in reality, the world does not exist and it never existed. Just as the snake, the rope we mistake as a snake, the snake never actually existed. It's just out of ignorance that we mistake the rope for the snake. Now, other schools subscribe, so Vishishtadvaita Vedanta of Ramanuja and Bheda Bheda Vedanta, they subscribe to the opposite doctrine, which is called Parinamavada. Parinama means transformation. So it's a doctrine of real transformation, that Brahman actually has become this world of names and forms. And even within this doctrine, there are many kind of subsets, and there are different ways of cashing out in what sense does Brahman transform into this world. I'm not going to go into too many details here because it will take me too far afield. But I wanted to mention this. In an Indian philosophical context, there are 2 main kinds of causality that are most important. These are also terms used by Aristotle. So Brahman can be considered the efficient cause of this world, and Brahman can also be considered the material cause of the world. So just to give you an analogy, which is very common in Indian philosophy, imagine that I'm a potter and I have a bunch of clay, and I shape this clay into different pots. The efficient cause of the pots is me, the potter. The material cause of the pots is the clay itself. Okay, so keep that in mind. So, according to two schools of Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta of Ramanuja and Bheda Veda, Brahman, the ultimate reality, is both the efficient cause, which is known in Sanskrit as the nimitta karana, and the material cause, which in Sanskrit is upadana karana, of the world. It's both. Brahman not only creates this world, like a potter creates pots, but Brahman actually becomes the world, in the sense of being the material cause of this world. You might wonder, well, where does this come from? The scriptures say it directly. I mean, at least the sort of surface meaning of the Chandogya Upanishad. There's a place where Chandogya Upanishad raises this question: what is the relationship between Brahman and the world? And it uses two really interesting metaphors. Clay and pots is one of them. Brahman becomes this world like clay can be fashioned into pots. And another one is gold and fashioning different kinds of ornaments out of gold, like bracelets and like earrings and like necklaces. So both of these seem to lend themselves to more of a parinamavada kind of interpretation. Brahman actually becomes this world. Okay, and then there are some, as I said, there are some details which I can't go into too much detail regarding, but for instance, according to Ramanuja's school of Vishishtadvaita, Brahman stands to the world as the soul stands to the body. So he uses this beautiful metaphor that this world is the body of God. And according to Bheda Veda, remember the etymology of the term Bheda Veda, Bheda difference, Abheda means non-difference. What Bheda Veda Vadans say is that Brahman is in one sense different from this world and in another sense non-different from the world. And the Shuddhadvaita school of Vallabha has a very interesting and somewhat paradoxical sounding doctrine called Avikrita Parinamavada. Parinama means transformation. Avikrita in Sanskrit means unchanged. So that's why I call it paradoxical, because it's the doctrine that Brahman actually transforms in this world while remaining unchanged. Because they're aware of this difficulty, which is that if it fully transforms in the world, it seemed to get infected with the bad qualities of this world. And so there's very elaborate philosophical discussion of how to avoid this problem. Okay. And finally, I wanted to mention one more school of Vedanta with regard to this third question. Madhva Vedanta takes a bit of a different tack. Instead of saying that Brahman is both the material cause and the efficient cause of the world, Madhva says this problem of evil is too serious and too dangerous. If you affirm that Brahman is also the material cause of the world, you can't help but ascribe all sorts of evil qualities to Brahman. So what he does is he says that Brahman is the efficient cause of the world, but not the material cause. So it's, as far as I'm aware, the only school of Vedanta, the only traditional school of Vedanta, which holds that Brahman is the efficient cause of the world, but not the material cause of the world, unlike other schools of Vedanta. Fourth big question. What is the relationship between Brahman and the individual soul? In Sanskrit, the term is jiva. As I said, the famous formula to encapsulate Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, then Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. You, each one of you, in your deepest essence, is identical to non-dual pure consciousness. That's Advaita's doctrine. There's no difference whatsoever between you and non-dual Brahman. It's out of ignorance that we think that we're individual souls sitting here at this lecture. Bhaskara's Aupadika Bheda Veda. Now, this is, I think, one of the least known schools of Vedanta, so I think it's interesting to compare his doctrine with Shankara's. And remember, he was a contemporary of Shankara's. And he said as usual, all these traditional Vedantic acharyas are very good at name calling. And so there's he calls Shankara a crypto-Buddhist. He says, you're just, teaching Buddhism, but in this crypto form, and it's nothing new, and it's also wrong. So, okay. So, Prachanda Bauddha is a Sanskrit term which they use. So according to Bhaskara's school of Aupadika Bheda Veda, the jiva is actually, in its swarupa, in its true essence, identical with Brahman. But Bhaskara says that Brahman is actually saguna, personal, not impersonal. So that's an important difference between Shankara's school and Bhaskara's school. And the other and then Bhaskara continues, and he says that even though we are in our essence identical with the personal God, Saguna Brahman, we become limited creatures out of ignorance because we're not aware of Brahman. Because we impose these different limiting adjuncts. He uses the same term as Shankara, upadis. We superimpose all these false qualities onto ourselves, thinking we're suffering and that we're transmigrating. In reality, we are Brahman, but understood as a personal God. And another key difference between Bhaskara's school and Shankara's school is that Bhaskara says that the upadis are actually real. What we superimpose, these different limiting adjuncts, are actually real. So Brahman actually becomes limited for a certain period of time until that soul attains liberation and realizes that the soul was Brahman all along. Whereas Shankara holds that the upadis are actually ultimately not real. The upadis also didn't exist at any point. We only thought they existed out of ignorance. Okay, so that's a fairly technical difference, but I just wanted to flag it. And all schools of Bheda Vedanta, again, remember the etymology of the term, claim that Brahman is in one sense different from the individual soul, and in another sense, non-different from the individual soul. And they use metaphors which should be familiar to some of us who have studied the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. You'll find that Sri Ramakrishna uses similar metaphors. One of the metaphors is, imagine an infinite ocean and the waves of an ocean. In one sense, the wave is not different from the ocean because it's nothing but water. In another sense, you can't say that the wave is identical to the ocean because it's a particular formation, right, which lasts for a certain period of time. So in that sense, it's also different from the ocean. So in the same way, these Bheda followers say that Brahman is, in one aspect or sense, non-different from the individual soul. In another sense, it's different from the soul. Okay, fifth big question. What is the state of salvation or moksha, the state of liberation? Let's say that through many lifetimes of spiritual practice and by God's grace, assuming you believe in God, we attain the state of liberation. Where do we end up? What does that look like, this beautiful, blissful state of salvation? Most schools of Vedanta claim that salvation is mukti, which means liberation. Liberation from what? Freedom from what? From rebirth. Because we have not realized the highest truth, which is Brahman, we have to come back again and again in new physical bodies and work out our karma. But when we attain liberation, we're free from the cycle of rebirth. But there's one school at least, Achinta Bheda Vedanta, remember that's Chaitanya school, which holds that the supreme goal, the highest goal, is not mukti. It's not liberation from rebirth. It's bhakti, supreme love of God. But then you might ask, well, what do they have to say about mukti? Do these supreme lovers of God not get mukti? No. Mukti, liberation from rebirth, according to this school, is an incidental byproduct of attaining supreme love for God. It's called tucca phala. Of course, it comes along. It's like just a kind of, you get a bonus, like a free packet. When you buy something very expensive, they give you a free product along with it just to kind of make you think that you're getting something really nice. Okay, now, the different schools of Vedanta differ on two key questions relating to salvation. And I want to talk about that briefly. Number one, what is the precise nature of salvation? What does it look like? And second, is it possible to attain Jivan Mukti? Jivan Mukti means liberation while still in this physical body. And different schools answer these questions in different ways. First question, what is the precise nature of salvation? According to two schools, Advaita Vedanta of Shankara and Bhaskara's Aupadika Bheda Veda, no sense of individuality remains in the liberated state. We don't remain as individuals in any sense whatsoever. The individual soul in the state of liberation merges completely in Brahman. Whether you understand Brahman as Nirguna Brahman like Shankara or as Saguna Brahman like Bhaskara. But in either case, you don't remain as an individual soul, as an entity separate from Brahman. But every other school of Vedanta holds that individuality in some sense remains even in the state of salvation. And more concretely, what they say is that, these are bhakti schools of Vedanta, what they say is that when you attain liberation, you finally are able to reside in an eternal heaven called loka in Sanskrit. And you eternally worship and serve the personal God. So if the school is based on love of Krishna, then it's a loka called Goloka or Vrindavana, where you lovingly worship and serve Krishna, and it's eternal. The individual soul remains there for an eternity. So that's an important difference. And in Advaita Vedanta, remember, Shankara says there's no coming and going. You don't go to anywhere. He thinks that's a kind of a silly idea. So instead, he says that ultimately, you just rest in your true nature, which is non-dual pure consciousness. So these are two fundamentally different paradigms for understanding the nature of post-mortem salvation. Second question, is Jivan Mukti, liberation while in the physical body, possible? Now, let's first focus on Advaita Vedanta because I think it's interesting. When I was a PhD student, I had a Facebook account. I don't have one now. But when I had Facebook, I remember under relationship status, one of the options was, it's complicated. And I think that if you ask Advaita Vedantins, do you accept liberation while still in the physical body? They'll say, it's complicated. Why do I say that? Because according to Shankara's school, this entire world of names and forms, including our physical bodies, are products of ignorance. Okay, now that's the first step. Second, let's imagine that I've attained the knowledge of Brahman. How do they define knowledge of Brahman? It means that you've completely eradicated ignorance. That's how they themselves define it, technically. Okay? Now, if you really eradicate ignorance completely, then the products of ignorance should also disappear. And if the physical body is a product of ignorance, there should be no physical body upon the attainment of complete liberation. So this is in a nutshell, the philosophical problem with justifying the possibility of Jivan Mukti, liberation while still in the physical body, from the standpoint of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And I don't want you to think that this is just because maybe, people who are opponents of Shankara say this. Shankara's own followers have grappled with this question for centuries and come up with, they acknowledge the problem. And I'll just mention a few examples. Madhusudana Saraswati and a number of others, Chitsuka and others. What they do is they say, yes, Jivan Mukti is possible. Liberation while in the physical body is possible. But even the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance. Avidya Lesha, it's called in Sanskrit. Even the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance which accounts for the continued existence of this physical body and the continued appearance of this illusory world. Okay? But then the question is, well, if the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance, in what sense is he or she completely liberated? He's not completely liberated. And so you may as well say, we don't believe in Jivan Mukti. so this is why I say the answer from the standpoint of Advaita Vedanta is, it's complicated. What about non-Advaitic schools of Vedanta? They adopt many different stances on this question. Do they accept Jivan Mukti? Ramanuja's school of Vishishtadvaita and Nimbarkar's school of Swabhavika Bheda Veda completely reject the possibility of Jivan Mukti. But remember, part of the reason is because for them, these are bhakti schools of Vedanta, the ultimate state is one of residing in an eternal heaven with the personal God, in serving and lovingly worshipping Vishnu or Krishna. And this world is certainly not that. We're not living in a heaven, unfortunately. Okay. Now, Madhva also rejects the possibility of Jivan Mukti. But one thing to keep in mind is that even Ramanuja and Madhva, they all believe in God realization while in the physical body. But even God realization is not tantamount to the highest state of salvation, which is after you leave the physical body. After you attain God realization in this physical body, you work out your remaining prarabdha karma, the karma that is yet to fructify. And only after you leave this physical body are you able to dwell in this, blissful eternal state of heaven with your personal God. Finally, sixth big question. This has to do with spiritual practices. Which spiritual practice leads us most directly to the knowledge of Brahman? And for many centuries, the different schools of Vedanta have been at loggerheads over this question, and they tend to say that one yoga, one kind of sadhana, spiritual practice, is higher than the other ones. Okay? So there are all sorts of hierarchies of spiritual practices. Another point, which I think is very important and which I think is underemphasized. Many of these Vedantic schools use the same terms to describe different spiritual practices. Jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion toward the personal God. Karma yoga. They don't always mean the same thing by these terms. And so you have to when you talk about Jnana yoga, for instance, the first question to ask is, Jnana yoga from whose standpoint? Ramanuja's standpoint, or Shankara's standpoint, or some other standpoint? I want to give you an example. Let's just focus on Jnana yoga. What is the practice of Jnana yoga according to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta? According to Shankara, the path of knowledge consists in three practices: Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. You listen to a Mahavakya, a great saying from the Upanishad. Thou art that Brahman. I am that Brahman. Tattvam asi. Aham Brahmasmi. Shravana. Manana. You reflect deeply on that teaching from all standpoints. At a kind of intellectual level, you remove doubts that might exist in your mind. Third, Nididhyasana. You try to deeply internalize that teaching that you are that Brahman and really try to live that and meditate on that deeply. And ultimately, that should result in the knowledge of Brahman. But what about Vishishtadvaita Vedanta? Ramanuja also accepts Jnana Yoga, but in a different sense. He says that Jnana Yoga is a practice of meditating on your true nature as an eternal soul, an eternal individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Okay, and I'm going to talk about this just in a bit. He also puts Jnana Yoga on, he says it's a preliminary discipline which makes you eligible to practice the higher discipline of Bhakti Yoga. So he kind of turns the table on Shankara here. But I'm jumping the gun here. So first of all, how does Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta hierarchize? How do they explain and relate the different spiritual practices? According to Shankara's school, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is the only direct path to knowledge of Brahman. What about Karma Yoga? What about Bhakti Yoga, the path of selfless action, the path of devotion for the personal God? He says they're good, they're not useless, but they only lead indirectly to the highest goal by purifying the mind and making the mind concentrated. So again, we can think about, it's like Shankara believes that bhakti is for inferior spiritual aspirants who are not yet up to the task of engaging in Jnana Yoga, the practices of Jnana Yoga. And he also claims that Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga cannot be practiced at the same time by any particular person. So he reconciles these yogas, but sequentially he says that Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga are meant for inferior spiritual aspirants. Once I attain total purity of mind, I stop practicing Bhakti Yoga, I stop practicing Karma Yoga, and I just focus exclusively on Jnana Yoga. And until I am eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, I shouldn't practice Jnana Yoga at all. So there's no question of practicing both Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga at the same time. This is Shankara's view. What about Ramanuja? As I just anticipated a little earlier, Ramanuja just turns the tables on Shankara. He says, oh Shankara, you're saying that Jnana Yoga is the higher practice, Bhakti is the lower practice. The truth is that Bhakti Yoga is the highest practice and Jnana Yoga is just a kind of feeder discipline. It's a kind of preparatory discipline. So what Ramanuja says is, through the practice of Jnana Yoga, meditation on your true nature as an eternal individual soul, which is a child of God, understood as a personal God, he says, it's only after you attain this realization, which he calls Atma Avalokanam, your realization of the individual eternal soul in your heart. It's only then that you can actually feel true bhakti, true love for God, because it's the soul that feels bhakti for God. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, imagine that God is like a giant magnet, an infinitely powerful magnet, and the soul, imagine, is like a needle. The soul is naturally attracted to the magnet. But then you might ask, well, why aren't we attracted? Why don't we feel that attraction? Because of these layers of the dust and dirt of impurities. So through spiritual practices, we remove those layers of dirt. And then the soul, we identify with that soul within, which naturally feels devotion for God. So Ramanuja has a similar idea in this context. One thing I wanted to mention in this context is Swami Medhananda ji. He's a very senior monk of our order. He's a vice president. He lives in Belumat. He was one of my acharyas, my teachers in training center in Belumat. And what he would say is that many, even monks in the order, they focus so much on Advaita Vedanta and I am that non-dual pure consciousness. They're skipping a lot of steps, which are very, very important in spiritual life. And one of the most important is realizing that you're an eternal individual soul, a jivatman, separate from the body-mind complex. Sri Ramakrishna, if any of you have studied the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, he says this. He mentions that when the mind, through spiritual practice, ultimately comes to the heart chakra, the fourth plane, the sadhaka, the spiritual aspirant, says, Eki, Eki, in Bangla. Eki, what is this? What is this? It's a kind of miracle. Because the sadhaka all along has been identifying with the body-mind complex. But once consciousness reaches up to the heart level, suddenly, the Sri Ramakrishna says, the sadhaka realizes the jivatman, the individual soul, in the shape of a flame. And it has this wonderful jyoti darshan. It means this wonderful vision of light. So he's saying this is the first spiritual realization that any sincere sadhaka should have. Only after that realization can you have the higher realizations of bhakti for God or even the realization of non-dual Brahman if you're following the path of knowledge. So I think that's very important for us from a practical standpoint as spiritual aspirants. Now, I wanted to focus for the remainder of this lecture on Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta. How do we understand the main doctrines of this, what I'm calling this new school of Vedanta, Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta? How does it relate to the traditional schools of Vedanta? What I think is most important to understand about Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta is that it's a Vedantic philosophy that harmonizes the existing traditional schools of Vedanta. And precisely because it harmonizes the traditional schools, it cannot be pigeonholed into any one of those schools. Because the moment you pigeonhole it in any one of them, it loses its harmonizing purpose, right? So, Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, what I call Vijnana Vedanta, begins with a very special spiritual experience, which he calls Vijnana. That's why I call it Vijnana Vedanta. And he says this all over the place in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He distinguishes two stages in spiritual realization, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana. So I want to read this to you because it's very important. Sri Ramakrishna says, the Jnani, meaning the follower of the path of knowledge, Shankara school, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the divine reality, which is nirguna, without attributes, is also saguna, with attributes, personal. Those who realize Brahman in samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become everything in this world. Brahman has become the universe and its living beings. This is known as Vijnana. So I want to bring your attention to two things especially. Okay, the Vijnani, first of all, is the one, he first attains the state of Jnana. He has knowledge of Brahman, which corresponds to reaching the roof. But the person on the roof, the person in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, feels Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Because you don't perceive the world. You know your true nature as Brahman. So the world feels to you to be non-existent. Then he says there's a small group of souls called Ishvarakotis. This small group of souls who are divinely commissioned, who can come back from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And that person finds that same Brahman, which is his true nature, has also become everything in this world as Shakti. Because the Vijnani sees that the reality which is Nirguna is also Saguna. Brahman is not only impersonal but also personal, which is otherwise known as Shakti in Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. And that Shakti has become absolutely everything we see around us. All the different names and forms, they're not unreal. They're different real manifestations of Shakti. Okay, so now, I want to revisit these 6 big questions, and how does Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta answer these 6 big questions? First question, what is the nature of ultimate reality? From the spiritual standpoint of Vijnana, Sri Ramakrishna says, you Shankarites are right that the ultimate reality is Nirguna, but you Bhakti schools are also right in saying that the ultimate reality, Brahman, is Saguna, personal. You're both right, because I've realized both aspects, and I've realized that the personal God and the impersonal Brahman are just different aspects, the static and dynamic aspects, respectively, of the same infinite divine reality. So he would often say, Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Brahman, meaning non-dual pure consciousness, and Shakti, the personal God, are inseparable but equally real aspects of the same reality. In an even more explicit teaching, he says, when I think of God as inactive, I call it Brahman, like static. Non-dual pure consciousness. When I think of that same God as creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, then I call it Shakti or Kali. So it's the same divine reality in different states. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, but you already mentioned that there are 2 schools of Vedanta which say the same thing, that Brahman is both Nirguna and Saguna, personal and impersonal. What are those schools? Achinta Bheda Bheda of Chaitanya and Shuddha Dvaita of Vallabha. That's true, but remember another thing I said about them, but there's still a hierarchy, and they say that Krishna is the supreme person. And Brahman, in the sense of Shankara, like the non-dual pure consciousness, is just a minor aspect of Krishna. Sri Ramakrishna doesn't go into this higher and lower talk. He doesn't go into hierarchies here. He says that the ultimate reality is in one aspect, Brahman, in another aspect, Shakti. And he doesn't say that Shakti is higher than Brahman. He doesn't say that Brahman is higher than Shakti. In fact, he uses a metaphor, a vivid metaphor. It's like fire and its power to burn. Ugni artha dahika shukti. And he says that just as you cannot think of fire without thinking of its fire to burn, just so you cannot think of fire's power to burn without thinking of fire. So Brahman and Shakti are mutually dependent and mutually entailing. And there's no hierarchy, no higher and lower there. That's the key difference, I think, between the Ramakrishna Vivekananda philosophy and even these schools which are broader by accepting both the personal and impersonal aspects of Brahman. Second big question, is the world real or unreal? Fortunately, the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Mohandanand Gupta, asked this question directly to Sri Ramakrishna, so we don't have to speculate. M asks, is the world unreal? He asked Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna says, why should the universe be unreal? That is how Advaitic Jnana Yogis reason. After realizing God, one sees that it is God himself who has become the universe and all living beings. And for those of you who don't know Bengali, unfortunately, I think that Swami Nikhilanandaji, who otherwise has produced a masterful English translation of the Kathamrita, the original Bangla text, there are certain places where I beg to differ respectfully. And this is one of them. Because when Sri Ramakrishna says, why should the world be unreal? The next sentence is, Osha bichared kotha. That's the talk of people who engage in Advaitic reasoning. But he translates it as, that is a matter for philosophical speculation or something like that, or philosophical discussion. So that really misses the fact that he's saying that. He's distinguishing two standpoints here. He says the world is considered to be unreal from the standpoint of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But from a different standpoint, namely the standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, you find that this world is a real manifestation of God. One sees that it is God himself who has become the universe and all living beings. And what was Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint? Obviously Vijnana Vedanta, because he says it again and again. I'm not a Jnani, I'm a Vijnani. Divine Mother has kept me in the state of Vijnana. So if we were to, I've already given you the standard formula to capture Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Is there a formula for Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta? I suggest the following one. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Why Brahma Shakti Satyam? Because the ultimate reality, according to Sri Ramakrishna, is not only impersonal Brahman, but also the personal Shakti. So Brahma Shakti. Whereas Shankara says Brahman is only Nirguna. So Brahma Shakti Satyam. Jagat Satyam. And because the ultimate reality is equally Brahman and Shakti, we find that this world is not unreal, but actually a real manifestation of Shakti. So in a formula, that's what I would say, Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. And incidentally, but importantly, Swami Turiyananji, a great direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, his last words on his deathbed were, Brahma Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Shutte Pran Pratishtito. All life itself is grounded in truth. So I think that's significant because he was one of the great, he had a great mind, and he was one of the few who explicitly thought about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And he also plumped for this Vijnana Vedanta kind of understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. Third big question, what is the relation between Brahman and the world? Well, Sri Ramakrishna says it explicitly. The Vijnani sees that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. And he really uses the word become in Bangla. It's hoyeche. Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. There's no way to avoid it. So it comes closer at least to Parinamavada, the doctrine of real transformation, than to Vivartavada of Shankara, which is the doctrine that this world is just an illusory appearance of Brahman. Now, working out the details of exactly what kind of Parinamavada, in what sense does Sri Ramakrishna mean that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles, that has yet to be worked out. It's worth thinking about, but it's because he doesn't work it out in detail. But it's something that we need to do as kind of thinkers and philosophers. But one thing I just wanted to point out again is, if you go back to the original scriptures, remember the way that Chandogya Upanishad explains the relationship between Brahman and the world. Brahman becomes this world in the way that clay can be fashioned into different pots, in the way that gold can be fashioned into different ornaments. That does seem to suggest something like real transformation in some sense. So I think that these scriptural statements in the Upanishads about the relationship between Brahman and the world lend themselves better to a Ramakrishnan Vijnana Vedanta interpretation than to a rope snake. I mean, Shankara really is in difficulty when he tries to interpret this passage, because he says that he brings in the rope and snake again. And he says that, the clay is like the rope and the pots are the snake, but it doesn't make sense. From a common sense standpoint, you don't say the pots are unreal. They're real manifestations of clay, as long as they last. So that seems to be what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. Fourth big question. That's 5. What is the relationship between Brahman and the individual soul? And here again, Sri Ramakrishna has a very beautiful teaching. This is also recorded in the Gospel. He's with a small inner circle of devotees, his closest devotees, and he says, "You are my very own. I tell you," when he says, "You are my very own," I'm telling you something very secret. Then you know this is a very important teaching. He says, "You are my very own. I tell you that I have come to the final realization, Shesh Ebujechi, that God is the whole and I am a part of him, that God is the master and I am his servant. Furthermore, I think every now and then that he is I and I am he." He would often quote Hanuman, speaking to Rama in this context. But notice, it's not just, you might say, well, he's quoting Hanuman, but that doesn't say it's his view. Here he explicitly says to an inner circle of devotees that this is my highest realization after so many years of sadhana and after so many kinds of spiritual realization. I am affirming the equal truth of all three of these standpoints, three different ways of relating with God. He would often use the metaphor of playing a 7-holed flute. And he would say, why should I only hit one hole and do this and say, I am Brahman, I am Brahman, I am he. That's boring. I want to play ragas and raginis on this flute. These are terms in Indian classical music, which means beautiful melodies, using all 7 holes of the flute. What does that mean? He relishes worshiping God and thinking of God and relating to God in so many different ways. As servant, as part and whole, as identical. That's the beauty of Sri Ramakrishna. And again, there's no higher and lower. Notice that. No hierarchy, unlike in other traditional Vedantic philosophies. 5th big question. What is the state of salvation according to Sri Ramakrishna? Again, he has really interesting views here, and I think these are under-discussed when we talk about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. So remember, there are 2 sub-questions. What is the precise nature of salvation, and is it possible to attain Jivan Mukti? First question, what is the exact nature of this post-mortem state of salvation, assuming we attain liberation? The wonder of Sri Ramakrishna is that he accepts, unlike any of the traditional schools of Vedanta, he accepts the highest ideal of Advaita Vedanta and the highest ideal of the Bhakti schools of Vedanta. According to Advaita Vedanta, the individual soul just merges in non-dual pure consciousness. That's it. There's no question of any heaven coming and going, anything like that. There's just Brahman. According to Bhakti schools, the individual soul resides in an eternal loka, a heaven, where you lovingly worship and serve and commune with the personal God. Sri Ramakrishna says, why can't both be true? And the metaphor I like to use is that I think Sri Ramakrishna conceives salvation as a kind of many-roomed mansion. There's not one room, there are hundreds of rooms. And the Christians can enter the Christian heaven room. Muslims can enter the Muslim heaven room, which is called Jannah, I believe in Arabic. And the Vaishnavas can enter the Krishna heaven room. Advaita Vedantins will get their non-dual pure consciousness like the salt all melting into the ocean. Why can't they all be true at the same time? In my last talk here, I talked about Sri Ramakrishna as a both and avatara. This is exactly that logic. Why not both? And finally, or not finally, the second sub-question of question 5, is it possible to attain Jivan Mukti, the state of liberation while in the physical body? His answer is an emphatic yes. But he doesn't run into difficulties that traditional Shankarites do because he redefines Jivan Mukti in a very different way. He says, this is a direct quotation, the person who firmly believes that God alone is the doer and he himself is a mere instrument is a Jivan Mukta. So notice he's defining Jivan Mukti from the standpoint of bhakti. I'm a mere instrument in the hands of God who's actually doing everything through me. And so because he doesn't define Jivan Mukti and doesn't accept the overall metaphysical framework of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, he doesn't have the difficulties that Shankarites have in justifying Jivan Mukti. 6th and finally, regarding spiritual practice, remember, every traditional school of Vedanta plays this game of higher and lower. You guys are good, but lower. And one path is the highest. Shankarites say Jnana Yoga is the highest. Bhakti schools of Vedanta say Bhakti Yoga is the highest. Sri Ramakrishna comes along and says, stop your quarreling. Because it's really just a matter of temperament. Some people, he says, are born as an amsha, as a portion of Vishnu, and they naturally are temperamentally inclined to devotion for the personal God. Other people are born as an amsha of Shiva, as a portion of Shiva. They feel naturally inclined to the path of knowledge. But there's no higher and lower. It's just a matter of temperament. So, finally, just to sum things up, because I know it's been a long lecture and some of it has been somewhat difficult, what are the 3 main takeaway points from what I've spoken about today? First of all, please refrain from making the mistake of equating Vedanta with any particular school of Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, because that's the most common mistake I find when I hear the word Vedanta bandied about. Usually what they mean is Advaita Vedanta, but if you mean Advaita Vedanta, say Advaita Vedanta, don't just say Vedanta. First thing. Secondly, Vedanta encompasses many different schools, only one of which is Shankara school. And there are many bhakti schools of Vedanta, which many of us don't know anything about. And if you want to know more about it, please read Swami Tapasanji's book, Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. Thirdly, what's unique and most valuable about Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta, this modern school of Vedanta? Swami Vivekananda used to call it a non-sectarian sect. This is very paradoxical language. Non-sectarian because this is a Vedantic philosophy which harmonizes all of the existing traditional Vedantic schools. But sect because you can't help but point out that there are some differences between this harmonizing philosophy and the traditional schools. Right? I mean, if Sri Ramakrishna asserts that the ultimate reality is equally personal and impersonal, it clearly conflicts with the doctrine of Shankara, which says that ultimately Brahman is only Nirguna. And it also clearly conflicts with the Bhakti schools, which say that Brahman is only Saguna. Right? So you can't help but take a stand on certain issues and point out differences between this broader harmonizing philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda on the one hand, and the traditional schools of Vedanta on the other. So in that sense, sect, it has concrete doctrines which are unique and broad, and which differ in certain respects from the doctrines of the traditional Vedantic schools. Okay, on that note, let us pray to the Holy Trio, Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother Sharada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda, that we can not just intellectually understand what Vedanta means, but practice it in our daily lives by making it practical and realize the highest goal of life. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Thank you, brother. Certainly for dummies. Any question? All clear? Very good.
Yeah, thank you, Swami Medhananda. I appreciate your lectures, and I hope this lecture and other lectures of yours are being compiled into a larger manuscript for future publication. That would be wonderful. Thank you. Kind of a two-part question, if I may. I'm glad you addressed Sri Ramakrishna's view of the Jivan Mukta. That is somebody who, in this material world, has achieved that liberation and yet is still reconciling the material world, i.e. the physical body, in order to, and I'd like to say, is this something synonymous perhaps with the Buddhistic Bodhisattva view? A. B. Where in this realm, Vedanta realm, does the Viveka Chudamani text lie?
Sure. So regarding Bodhisattva, I like the connection you make, but I would say that the Bodhisattva specifically aligns with what Sri Ramakrishna used to call Ishvara Kotis, who come to this earth not because of their own karma, because they have to work out some more karma, but out of compassion for souls who are struggling on this earth and who are suffering from ignorance. So I think it's an elite category of soul which comes down to this earth, assuming a physical body for the sake of helping humanity. Second question is, what about Vivekachudamani? Where does it fit in? Many people think that this work was composed by Shankaracharya. I believe it was not, and it's not just me, but most scholars think it was not. And the reason is because if you study the Vivekachudamani carefully, you'll find that the doctrines don't actually agree in certain respects with the doctrines taught by Shankara in his commentaries. I'll give you one example. In the Vivekachudamani, the world is often likened to a dream. And it's often said in the Vivekachudamani that there's no difference fundamentally between the waking state and the dream state. Shankara directly refutes this doctrine in his Brahma Sutra commentary, because the Yogacara school of Buddhism held the same view, that there's no difference in reality between the waking state and the dream state. And what Shankara says is that's wrong for a bunch of reasons. He gives like 7 reasons why the waking state is more real than the dream state, but that both states are sublated, are transcended when you attain knowledge of Brahman. So that's one example. But also, another work that's known to be Shankara's is Upadesha Sahasri, the 1,000 Teachings. That's known to be his, no doubt about that. But the problem is, and there's a poetic section and there's a prose section. If you look at the way he composed poetry in Upadesha Sahasri, which is known to be his, and you compare that with the poetry of Vivekachudamani, it's completely different in style. In fact, Vivekachudamani is arguably much more beautiful than Shankara's Upadesha Sahasri. And so many people think that, I would say most scholars think that Vivekachudamani was composed by a later follower of Shankara, but not Shankara himself. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to quote something from the Gospel, first in Bangla, and then I'll try to translate that. সব পথ দিয়ে তাকে পাওয়া যায়, সব ধর্মই সত্য, ছাদে ওঠা নিয়ে বিষয়, তুমি পাকা সিঁড়ি দিয়ে উঠতে পারো, কাঠের সিঁড়ি দিয়ে উঠতে পারো, বাঁশের সিঁড়ি দিয়ে উঠতে পারো, আর দড়ি দিয়ে উঠতে পারো, আবার একটি আচল আওয়াজ দিয়ে উঠতে পারো. Ramakrishna is saying,
Sri Ramakrishna
is saying, we can achieve God by many different paths. Going to the roof is the intention, and we can do that with the concrete stairs made of concrete, or stairs made of wood, or even use a bamboo, or even use a rope to climb up. So my question is, even Swami Vivekananda said use 4 different paths:
Mm.
Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. So how am I going to be clear which will be my inclination?
As I said, it depends on your temperament. Swami Vivekananda, he used to say, no person is born into a religion. Each person has a religion in the depths of his or her soul. So the first step in spiritual life is to first do some introspection. Ask yourself, what is that custom-made, individualized religion in the depths of my heart, which is for me alone? You know, Swami Vivekananda would sometimes say these wonderful things. And one thing he said is, it's not a surprise and it's not regrettable that every world religion has ultimately split into different sects. He says, I wish that sects would multiply until every individual had his or her own religious sect. But the idea behind that is, you'll make the most progress and you'll be happiest in practicing religion if you practice the religion that's uniquely suited to your nature. You see, so as a general scheme, you can say there are these 4 basic yogas. First question is, which yoga am I naturally, temperamentally inclined towards? Second question is, but of course they're not airtight compartments and you can of course practice them together. Unlike what some of the traditional schools say, like Shankara school. And what Swami Vivekananda always taught is, even though through any of these yogas you can attain the highest goal, it's better and more spiritually productive, and it makes for a more all-rounded personality if you try to combine all 4 yogas to the best of your ability. So this is the I would say, a short answer to your question. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks for your talk, Swami.
Thanks.
I'm curious, I'm going to ask this question because I think you may be one of the only people I know that can answer it, but did people ever find any personal biases in the founders of these different sects, like, you know, if they were educated or not, region, caste, or anything like that?
Sorry, just clarify that a little bit. I mean, what kind of personal biases do you mean? Like,
well, I'm wondering if maybe, you know, some originators from a higher caste, more educated.
Oh, I see.
And maybe some were, you know, not educated, thus gravitated towards.
Okay, they were all Brahmins, basically, because if you weren't Brahmin, you can't found a school. So unfortunately, there was that kind of social hierarchy. So Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, they're all Brahmins. And the other, another way of answering your question is, Swami Vivekananda, even though he revered and admired Shankaracharya, he sometimes said some pretty critical things about him. And one of the things that he took him to task for was his casteism, what he considered to be his casteism. And he accused him of having narrowness of heart, Shankirno Hriday in Bangla. And he said the reason is because, according to Shankara's commentaries, the study of Advaita Vedanta is only available to Brahmins and nobody else. If we were really strict followers of Shankara, then Swami Vivekananda could not have become a sannyasi and he couldn't have studied Advaita Vedanta, let alone preached it to the world, because he was not a Brahmin, right? So this casteism and caste hierarchy is something that has been a problem in India. And sometimes that does affect the way that they explain their philosophies. Thanks. I think you had a question in the front, and then I'll come to you. Please give the mic to him.
Thank you, Swamiji, for the wonderful lecture.
Thanks.
I think the question of real and unreal, right? We need to define what is real and what is unreal. I think in Shankara's philosophy, real is clearly defined as something independent and eternal. So if we take that definition, I think none of these, whatever other philosophies that are saying is real, obviously flat, outright wrong. So I think when you say world is real, what is your definition of real?
Right. So I think that these bhakti schools of Vedanta, even Sri Ramakrishna, would say that the world exists, even from the ultimate standpoint, even if it's not eternal. And in a certain sense, it's still eternal. You know how? Because in Hinduism, creation is cyclical. There isn't a starting point, a beginning point to this creation. There's only expansion and contraction, which in some ways resonates with modern physics. Right now, this universe is in a manifested state, expanded state. Eventually, it'll contract back. It doesn't mean it disappears. It's not that it just completely ceases to exist. It contracts. Even then, it's real, but it's like, the entire tree is contained in the seed, right? And the tree is, in a sense, real within the seed. It's just not manifest. It's not expanded into that form. So, in any case, reality means that... So, remember again, rope snake. Did the snake ever exist? No. It's out of ignorance that I think that there's a snake there. In fact, there's the rope all along. And these bhakti schools do not accept that. They say that if you accept the scriptural teachings, which is that Brahman becomes this world in the way that clay is fashioned into pots, in the way that gold is fashioned into different ornaments, you say that, yes, for the time, however many years that my gold necklace exists, it really exists. And not that once it disintegrates into gold after 5,000 years, that it never existed. That doesn't seem very commonsensical to me. Do you see what I mean? So that's where the real philosophical debate lies.
I think the dependency and independency, it becomes a little bit complicated. I mean, I see that eternality, you can say that contraction and that makes somewhat sense. But dependency, we cannot, separate the Shakti, whatever, Saguna Brahman, from as an independent entity from Nirguna Brahman.
Yeah.
Obviously, Saguna Brahman has a dependency on Nirguna Brahman. Otherwise, the conscious God doesn't make any sense.
The what God, sorry?
When somebody asks you, is your God conscious? Then, the consciousness precedes the existence of the God. So you are obviously admitting that, Nirguna Brahman precedes the Saguna Brahman, and Saguna Brahman has a dependency on Nirguna Brahman. So since the dependency of Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman is there, I'm not making a distinction that one is superior or other is inferior. I'm just theoretically saying that, what is real, what is unreal. Real has to stand up by its own, and it should be eternal. Probably on the eternal factor, there is a point where it's contracting.
No, this is very good. This is a very subtle point. So you're saying that the Shankarite position, the Advaita Vedantic position, that there's a kind of one-way dependence of Shakti on Brahman, but not Brahman on Shakti, is the more logical view. The reason being, I think, is what you're saying, is that because Shakti has no consciousness apart from Brahman, but that's exactly where the Bhakti schools differ. And that Shakti is fully conscious. And it's one with Brahman, so you can't artificially separate Brahman from Shakti. And remember Sri Ramakrishna's metaphors. They're always bidirectional. I already mentioned this, but fire and its power to burn. And then Sri Ramakrishna immediately goes on to say, you cannot think of fire aligned with Brahman without thinking of fire's power to burn, which is Shakti. You also cannot think of fire's power to burn, which is Shakti, without thinking of fire itself. So it's a bidirectional dependence. So I think that these schools, these Bhakti schools of Vedanta and Sri Ram... Maharaj, she has a question up in the front there. So she's next. That would be the short answer. And what they would say is that Shakti itself, the personal God, is conscious. It doesn't need to borrow its consciousness from Nirguna Brahman. So it would reject the premise of your question, basically. Thank you.
Maybe
I think there are questions over there. Yeah.
So, simple question. So, our model of spiritual life is that we progress, make our mind purer and purer, and reach a particular goal. And we say that all religions reach to the same goal. So, in that sense, how do you understand? Like we see Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Shankaracharya, and Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, they are all realized souls. But how do you reconcile the fact that they are interpreting the final goal in different ways? And how is Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta not seen by Shankaracharya if he is realized soul? And if he has seen the truth, why didn't he see what Sri Ramakrishna saw?
This is a wonderful question. And so my answer is, I would bring in the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant, which Ramakrishna would often use. He would say that, imagine there are 5 blind men, each touching a different part of the same elephant. And the person touching the trunk says, I know what this elephant is like, it's dry and scaly. Another guy who's touching the tail says, you're completely wrong, the elephant is furry and soft. And all 5 of these start quarreling, touching different parts of the elephant. Then who is the one who adjudicates this debate between the 5 blind men? It's the person with vision who sees the whole elephant, who says, you're all right and you're all wrong. You're all right because you're all touching real aspects of the elephant. But you're all wrong in generalizing and thinking that that aspect of the elephant that you're touching exhausts the nature of the entire elephant. Similarly, Sri Ramakrishna says in one place in the Gospel, even realized souls sometimes have one-sided realizations of God. The Shankarite is the one who has the realization only of the nirguna aspect, the impersonal aspect of God. Bhakti schools will have also, to a certain extent, limited realizations. The Christian mystic, great realized souls, Saint Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, they might have a vision of Christ or God the Father. Muslims of Allah, and they're different. Ramanuja, he had a very specific idea of Vishnu Narayana. That was his idea of God. And he wears these earrings, he holds a discus and a mace, and there's this very elaborate, right? So different realized souls can realize God in different forms and aspects, but they're all realizing one and the same God. And who is the one who realizes that? The person who has realized multiple forms and aspects of God. The person with vision, who sees the whole elephant, that's the Vijnani. Thanks.